everyone, welcome to another episode of Conversations with Certrec. With me today, I have Evan Teacock, Steve Dixon, and David McNeil, and we're here to discuss PRC-005. As you may know, there were a couple of recently issued violations, so we are here to discuss what they were and how you can avoid them. Let's have a conversation. All right, guys, thanks to you for joining Conversations with Certrec. We're, of course, going to discuss PRC-005 here. So the first question we have is, what exactly is PRC-005 and why is it so important to the reliability of the bulk electric system?
PRC-005 is important to the bulk electric system from the standpoint of that it is actually testing the battery systems, the protective relays, control circuitry, sudden pressure type relays, which all of these are necessary to ensure that if there is an issue with the generators systems, that it actually will disconnect when needed, those particular devices. You know, the generator, you want to get that generator offline if there's a fault. You want to trip transformers to get them off the system so it doesn't drag down the system. You don't want a fault causing the dragging down of the system. That's in essence why it's reliable and why you need it to be. Those systems need to be reliable.
In the past, historically, a lot of major system events have started and been traced back to either failures of protective relay systems or protective relay systems not working in the way that they expected them to work. And it's important that our clients, the generator owners, the transmission system owners, all maintain that equipment so that it performs as expected.
It really does come down to, we want to protect the integrity of the whole system. We don't want a blackout to happen like happened in the Northeast or in 2003, I think it was. And we want to minimize that. And it's the individual generator's responsibility to ensure that they are not the cause of a major disruption of our power for everyone.
So I guess what I hear you guys saying is that PRC-005 is pretty important. It's pretty big, and it can be challenging because it's so big and, you know, it does encompass a lot of different things. So what are some of the commonly missed areas of sites' protection system maintenance programs?
That's a big question, Michelle. With PRC-005, it's one of the few standards, maybe the only standard, that requires the generator owners and transmission owners to go through and do a very detailed analysis of all the protection system equipment and to identify those components that are key to protecting the bulk electric system. The very first challenge there, and the one that we find is frequently the one that hangs people up, is just the initial identification of those protection system components that are subject to the standard. Once you clear that hurdle, then you've got an even more challenging maintenance program that you've got to satisfy. And once you identify those components, then you've got to make sure that the employees at the plant and the contractors that you hire perform those maintenance requirements as they're specified in the standard. Prior to version 2 of the standard, the requirements were, from a maintenance perspective, kind of left up to the owners. They were allowed to develop their own maintenance programs and to develop them, in ways that were not specified by NERC, but were more industry accepted practices. With version 2 of the standard, NERC said, well, we feel like to really preserve the reliability of the entire system, we need to come up with some more prescriptive standards. And those maintenance requirements are going to be these tasks, at a minimum, these tasks, and these tasks have to be performed at intervals not to exceed, these periods. And what we've found is that when you go in and start looking at the classifications of equipment, there are certain classifications of equipment that are more difficult to satisfy or more susceptible to error. And there are also specific maintenance tasks within those classifications that are that seem to be more problematic for our clients, either in terms of meeting the documentation requirement to demonstrate compliance with the maintenance task, or maintaining the interval.
So that's a really interesting piece you brought up at the very beginning, right? The identification. So there has to be a fundamental understanding of what the PRC-5 standard says, right? And all the requirements before you ever even start the identification process.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's critical that the client understand the language in the standard. What the standard says is that you have to identify protection system equipment that's used to identify and isolate faults on the bulk electric system. NERC, since the issuance of the standard, NERC has provided some supplemental guidance that also identifies equipment that may not specifically protect components that are part of the BES, but nevertheless affect the bulk electric system and its reliability. So it's critical that you not only identify the components as they're specified in the applicability section of the standard, but also look at that supplement and look at some of the protective relaying equipment identified in that standard. That's critical to satisfying the requirements and being compliant with PRC-5.
Part of that is going to be making sure you have up-to-date drawings. One of the things that we have seen with some of the sites out there is that they're not necessarily keeping up with their facility drawings. To be able to identify the components properly, you do need an updated set of drawings to go along with that.
Also with that is, as the plant matures and you upgrade your equipment, you have to go back to the equipment list, ensure that you have captured the protected functions of the new equipment. Sometimes they'll, as equipment changes and as technology progresses forward, some of the internal protective actions aren't seen, aren't apparent, and we have to make sure that we are capturing them also, because that has been missed before.
That's interesting. So we've got a list, we've got drawings, we've got to go in and maintain them as they go on, right? And we've got to make sure we meet all the deadlines for all of that in PRC-5. So, wow, I mean, it is a big one, and obviously that's why it is a big challenge. So recently, we all know that there were 2 facilities that did have PRC violations, PRC-5 specifically violations. So let's talk about the first facility that, we've all discussed. How many violations did they have? What did those look like? Can you share a little bit of information about those violations?
Yeah, for the first facility, there were 215 violations from a period of 2012 to 2015. Primarily, these were missed type of checks within their system.
From what I understood, also, the owner identified some of these missed maintenance activities and going into an audit, and then as part of the audit, there were additional missed activities identified. We always encourage our clients to keep very precise records about their maintenance activities and to track them carefully, and we provide them with tools to do that. It's clear that this client either didn't understand which components needed to be maintained or didn't understand how the maintenance requirements specified in PRC-5 applied to those components. And it was a pretty broad scope failure of their maintenance program.
So they fell in many of the categories then that you guys have been discussing. It sounds like they maybe didn't identify everything correctly. There was the ongoing maintenance, meeting those compliance dates there as well. So it was just maybe a lot of misunderstanding, we think, is what drove to those violations?
There seems to be a discrepancy in who was putting the records in and who was overviewing that. And there was a breakdown in that area in this one specific state, but that is very important. You have to have the procedural checks and backstops to ensure that the records that are going into the PRC-5 documents are up to date and maintained and correct, or you'll wind up with 215 instances of incorrect documentation or lack of documentation.
So there's got to be ownership as well then. So you've got to have people that understand that they have the action to review PRC-5 lists or the drawings at certain regular occurrences. There's got to be a level of ownership as well.
Yeah, throughout the organization, it doesn't just stop at a maintenance group. Say it's through the whole ownership of the site and who maintains that responsibility. You know, it's from top down, bottom up type thing.
Michelle, I don't know if this was the case with this particular entity, but one of the things that I've seen in the past with some of our clients is that they'll have a fleet of generators and they'll hire contractors to come in different areas around the country, and they'll perform the maintenance, and they'll write a scope of work for the contract. They'll have the contractor come in. The contractor will do what they believe is the correct scope of work, and the entity, the generator owner, will take that documentation and they'll put it in a file, and they'll preserve it for audit purposes. But then sometimes they fail to go back and carefully check it to verify that either all the documentation's there, and also to verify that the contractor performed all the work they expected them to do. And sometimes we'll find when we go back and look at that documentation that either there was a misunderstanding about the scope of work, or the contractor just failed to perform something that they knew was in the scope of work, but they, through all the hectic outage activities that are going on, they just either failed to preserve the records of those maintenance tasks, or just failed to do them altogether. So yeah, I think like Steve was saying, it's critical that you have not only the people performing the work take ownership of the activities that they're performing, but you have, from a management level, you have ownership of the documentation, and you have some accountability for going back and evaluating and assuring that the documentation you've got says what you think it says.
So that really falls in what I like to call trust but verify, right? So we trust that they're going to do it right, but we're going to double check just to be sure, which, ultimately it comes down to that registered entity, right? They're going to be the one that sees the fine. They're going to be the one getting the violations, not that contractor. So it's always a good plan to review that to make sure you got exactly what you expected. And if there's anything, sometimes those reports have actionable items, right? They have steps they need to take. And if you just file it, you might have missed something that, they're telling you that's important. So agreed, really important to check those out, the reports.
Yeah, so, and to that point, Michelle, part of PRC-5 says that when you identify an issue, an unresolved maintenance issue with some of your protective system maintenance program, you have an obligation to document the activities that you're performing to follow up on that deficiency. And we've seen instances where plant manager may have had, on his to-do list to check all the maintenance records, and he checked them, but failed to recognize that there was a deficiency, that one of the pieces of the protection system or one of the components of the protection system didn't operate as it was supposed to. And they may go and fix that. There may be some delays in getting that fixed. And if the time that's required to recognize and correct that deficiency goes beyond the maintenance interval, then it becomes what PRC-5 classifies as an unresolved maintenance issue. And that triggers additional requirements to document your activities to correct that deficiency. And that's where we sometimes find our clients get into trouble, is that they don't document those activities. They may be doing all the right stuff, but when it comes audit time, they've got to scramble around and find out, okay, where did I issue that purchase order and all that. And so that's something that's, when you say follow up, that's a big issue.
Yeah, the auditors always say if it's not written down, it didn't really happen. So it's really important to make sure it's written down what you did, and to keep it organized, right? So your audit is smooth. You have all the information there, and you're not scrambling at audit time. There's enough going on during an audit. Being organized can certainly help. So is there anything else notable you guys would like to add about, the registered entities here that received the violations recently?
I'd like to add also that there was falsified records during the audit that were determined going through it. Part of that could have, and I won't get into too much, but background for why they might have come out. But if a site or a facility does not have all the documents, they may have a tendency to want to falsify documents. And I would say that is definitely not the right thing to do. If you don't have a document, you just want to go ahead and say, we don't have it, and provide that information. That could lead to a lot more trouble and not having a good relationship with your auditor in the end when you're going through these audits.
I would agree with that. The transparency is key in maintaining a good working relationship with your auditor. NERC has provisions for self-reporting failures or deficiencies in your maintenance program, and working through that in a process that's very structured, and it makes sure that you get your maintenance program back on the right track. And that's a lot less painful than finding out that you've got some employees that have been trying to cover up deficiencies or as in this case, create records that don't truly reflect the maintenance that was performed. And that's you never want to be in that situation with a regulator. And you need to make sure that everyone in your everyone in the organization, from your field people to your contractors, understand the importance of being transparent and documenting everything correctly. That needs to be communicated from the top down.
Absolutely. So I think that pretty much closes out the first registered entity that we've been discussing. So let's jump to the second one, because there were two that recently received those PRC-5 violations. So the second registered entity, how many violations are we talking about for that one? And, what was the span of those violations? What issues did we see there?
325 were along the lines of making sure that the proper maintenance was done timely. They've missed quite a few items from a standpoint of they did not understand all their components that they had under the purview of PRC-25, and it was lacking within their documents for performing the maintenance.
I think this goes into what we were talking about the very first, was understanding very clearly what equipment has to be on the list. And then once you have that understanding, then you can build your list. But it looks like they had a lack of understanding of what actually they had to have on the list, and then it just carried on through historical documents to some extent.
And if you don't have that initial understanding of what really falls, it's really hard to perform maintenance, right? Because you may not be performing maintenance on the right things if you don't have a good list. So,
and then it's very hard to catch up. Once you do figure out what you have, then you have to go back and you have to try to catch up. And now you're looking through, as David said, dusty files in the middle of the night, trying to find out what you have.
Sure.
And part of that goes into, if you have multiple generators on a site, you need to make sure you look at each and every generator, whatever it might be. Once you are classified as needing to be NERC registered, you need to make sure all those pieces of equipment that actually can produce power and are connected to the bulk electric system have the proper maintenance, and all the functions and all the devices are in your list.
I believe the report said that 325 potential violations or violations constituted about 6% of the total population of maintenance activities that they reviewed or that were within the scope of that time period. And that kind of gives you a feel, if you take 325 and multiply by 18, that kind of gives you a feel of the volume and the amount of work and effort and documentation that has to go into demonstrating compliance with PRC-5.
Just real quick, David, what would you say some of those might have been that, we're going a little bit speculation here, but what would you say some of those would have been, along the lines of relay CTs? In
my experience, batteries are always an Achilles heel. And unless a generator or an entity has taken the time to develop a rigorous battery testing program, that's one of the areas where we find deficiencies. And it's for a lot of reasons. First of all, batteries are one of those components of the plant that people don't give a lot of thought about. It's they sit over in the corner quietly doing their job, and you go by once every 3 or 4 months, and you look at them, and you do sort of a visual inspection, and you check a couple of things, and you're done for maybe the next year or so, depending on the type of batteries that you use or that you have installed at your plant. The other is that people don't always understand exactly what is intended by the standard when they get into the battery testing program. So they'll go along and they're well-intentioned and they want to do everything that's required. They just don't understand the standard, and they don't understand what it is that NERC expects. So, my first guess would be that a significant number of those violations probably had to do with their DC supply systems and their batteries. I would say one of the areas that we find deficiencies frequently has to do with instrument transformers, CTs and PT testing. And this is something that is sort of a recurring issue within the history of PRC-5. Years ago, people had sort of an industry standard practice for testing instrument transformers, CTs and PTs. And it was very thorough and it's very, very rigorous. And when version 2 of PRC-5 came out, NERC said, well, that's all fine and good, but we have a specific maintenance requirement that we want you to perform. We've seen all the testing that you've done, and you've done an excellent job of demonstrating that those instrument transformers work well. What we weren't doing a particularly great job of was verifying the integrity of the cables that carried those current and voltage signals back to the relays. So NERC issued a more prescriptive requirement. They said, we want you to verify that those CTs and PTs are producing signals and that those signals are reaching the relays that they're intended to reach. And for whatever reason, certain testing contractors and generator owners weren't aware that the testing they had been doing didn't satisfy this new requirement. And I think a lot of people continued on, hiring contractors and doing the testing themselves, and continued doing the testing using the same method that they'd done for years because it had always been adequate, and they believed that methodology was sufficient to satisfy the new requirement. What they found out sometimes through internal audits, sometimes through NERC audits, was that although that testing was very, very good in identifying problems with the actual CTs or PTs, it didn't do a great job on verifying the integrity of those cables back to the relay. And so we've seen a lot of self-reports. We've seen these come up as issues in audits, and so that's a frequent got-you out there that we try to alert everybody to this, and the standard's been in place for a long time now, and it's I'm sure aggravating to the auditors to find these testing methodologies not adapting. But part of the problem with this is that the interval of the test is so long. It's a 12-year interval to do these tests. So, I'm sure for years now, we'll need to continue to do this. And we encourage our clients to send us their scope documents when they get ready for an outage, when they're going to be doing maintenance that's going to be, done to satisfy the requirements of PRC-5. We encourage them to send us their scope document, let us look it over and see if we see anything or any ways that we can improve that document so that there's better communication between the client and the contractors.
That's great sharing. Thank you. So for these two entities, what were the fines? Were they big? Were they small? What are we talking about that they're currently looking at for both of them?
They were pretty significant fines, 6-digit numbers in the $300,000 to $400,000 range, which sounds like a lot of money. And to generators today, it is a lot of money. It's it can be a big part of your earnings for the year. But if you look at it in the scope of what NERC is capable of fining someone, what their regulatory authority is, it's just really a fraction of what they're capable of fining someone.
So it's not that great, but it could have been a lot worse.
Exactly. It's painful, and it was meant to draw the attention of senior management in the company. But like I said, if you look at all the legal documentation that authorizes NERC to issue penalties, civil penalties for infractions, they have the legal authority to issue a fine up to $1 million per day per violation.
And some of that, NERC will evaluate the fine based on repeat conditions. If they have had a violation in the past, they will, sometimes they'll give you a smaller fine, or they'll say, okay, it's a compliance exception. But if it's repeated again, then the fine typically would be higher in those situations. They'll let you kind of have a little bit of a pass for the first one. The second one, no, they're gonna come in and fine you.
So at that point, it's based on, your mitigating activities. Did you do them? Did you not? And then is it a repeat, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Michelle, because NERC looks for ways to give you credit for doing good things. They like good performers. They like entities that try to do the right thing. And so if you have a strong maintenance program and you've shown due diligence in trying to achieve compliance with PRC-5, they'll give you credit for as much as they can, and they'll use that credit to mitigate any enforcement, any civil penalties that they calculate. So, I think it's important to recognize that NERC's not out there with a big stick waiting to beat people. If you're a good actor, if you're an entity that strives to maintain the reliability of your equipment, you'll be given credit for that. It's the entities, like Evans was saying, you messed up once, okay, we'll help you get back on the right track. If you mess up the second time, sometimes NERC interprets that as, well, you're not really paying attention to us, you're not paying attention to the requirements, you're not being a good member of this community, of the wholesale power community.
I think also not just a monetary penalty, but also you were talking about the reputation. And we have our clients in all the generation facilities, we have shareholders, and this is not a private thing. This is a public action that comes out. So people know about it, and they know that they can see the issues that you've had in your plant, and they can start holding you accountable that way also. So I think it's not just the regulatory, but it's also the public and your reputation in the industry.
So one of the main goals we have here at Certrec, of course, is to learn from our operating experience and to share those lessons learned with our clients. So can you guys talk a little bit about some of our OE that we've learned from our different clients?
Michelle, we at Certrec have clients with generators with virtually every type of technology you can think of. We have nuclear plants, we have clients with coal plants, gas plants, solar plants, wind farms, even battery storage facilities. And we've worked with all of these clients to help get their maintenance programs in a state that will assure continued compliance. We deal with old plants, new plants, even plants that are under construction. And we help those clients organize their maintenance programs, identify the tasks they have to perform, set up tracking systems to make sure that they perform them. We even sometimes will make site visits to help identify all the maintenance requirements and meet with the plant managers and the maintenance managers and walk through their maintenance practices and talk about the specific methodologies that they apply. In one instance, I can remember working with a older coal plant. I believe the plant was about 60 years old, and we were going through talking to the plant's engineer about the protection systems, and I was talking to him about some specific relays on one of the drawings, and he stopped me and he said, "What revision are you working on?" And I told him it was Rev 15 or whatever. He said, "Well, my operators don't even have that revision. We're working off of Rev 12. So, the more we get involved, the more we can work with that client to identify those little got-yous. Like Evans mentioned earlier, one of the important things to make sure of is that you're using the most current drawings. And if your drawings don't reflect the as-built condition of your plant and its configuration, you want to make sure that they are up to date, because not only your operators and your maintenance people, but the auditors are going to look at those drawings, and they're going to accept those drawings as what they believe is out there in the plant. And if there's something that's not correct, and your maintenance program shows that you're not maintaining a relay that you took out of service 20 years ago, you're going to get questions in the audit about that. And when the auditors find that there are discrepancies in those drawings, that's going to be problematic. So we've made site visits. Some of our clients have even asked us to come on site during their maintenance programs, while they were performing that maintenance, and help them track the activities, and even spend time at wind farms in the field watching the contractors that were performing maintenance, and making sure everything was documented properly and all that documentation was collected.
So is it fair to say that we really go in with a questioning attitude, and those questions really come from our experience and the gotchas and all those other things that we've seen over the last several years as we've been helping entities?
I think also what we have here at Certrec is the ongoing relationship we have with our clients. It's not just waiting for an audit period to start working with them. It's weekly and bi-weekly phone calls, going through the action tracking system to ensure that as much as we can, they're audit ready at all times. And that in that relationship, we start sharing, and we have a better idea of what the condition of their plant is, protection system wise, so that we can help them and along that, make sure that they are audit ready. That's our goal, is to make sure that they are audit ready at any time. But it's not just a surprise and then everyone, all hands on deck to try to fix a problem at the audit time. It's an ongoing process to ensure and to help them to be successful.
Kind of what you were saying earlier, our experience and questioning attitude. I know all of our folks have very good questioning attitudes. I know when they go through a maintenance performed item, that they are actually asking questions, not of themselves or of the about the document, but they actually go to other folks. I know that both Steve and David, start asking questions if something doesn't look right, so that we can get that back and feed that information back to the client as soon as possible. Hopefully before they close out their maintenance cycle, to say whether they met the requirements. There's some tricky relays out there that the folks don't really know how to perform the proper maintenance on them. Some of those are sudden pressure. Either they're forgetting to do them or they don't do them correctly. So the definitely questioning attitude within our side really helps to provide feedback to the clients.
That's great. So I just have one more question for you guys. I'd like to give you a what if, hypothetical type situation. So let's all pretend that, Certrec was the program manager for these two registered entities that just received these violations before they received these violations. What would Certrec have done to help them prevent these violations and thus obviously saving them the money that they're about to expend as well? So what kind of things, tools, programs, processes would we have put in place to help them be compliant?
Well, I'm working with a client right now who is in the process of self-reporting some compliance issues. And what we do when we find out a client, or we acquire a new client that has some history with some maintenance problems, we go back and we investigate those. We don't just look at the paperwork. We investigate, and we interview and talk to the people who actually did that work, or the people who supervise that work, and we find out, specifically what did you do versus what did you document. And we try to identify all of the activities associated with that piece of equipment. Sometimes we're able to find mitigating information that affects the impact of a potential noncompliance on a bulk electric system, and that's it's gratifying for us, and it helps the client, because even though they're having to go through the process of self-reporting an issue, if they've had someone come in with the questioning attitude that Evan's mentioned, and we go through and we look at everything in the program, not only what their maintenance people do, but what their operators are doing, what they're monitoring, and identify areas where we can mitigate the impact of those failures, then that goes a long way to addressing concerns that the regulators might have when they read this potential noncompliance and when they start investigating it, and also helping them identify what mitigation was performed. Sometimes they say, well, we did this, but they don't know the timeline. They don't know when things happen. So we go back and we look at operator logs, we look at maintenance records, and we say, okay, this deficiency was identified in this date, and here 3 days later you fixed it. And during that 3 days, we monitored that piece of equipment to make sure that it hadn't failed. So we did everything within our power to mitigate the impact of that deficiency on that piece of equipment. So there's a lot of things that we can do to help a client when they find themselves in a situation to minimize the compliance risk to the entity by self-reporting this in a way that properly portrays its risk to the bulk electric system.
Great. So we'd help them mitigate. Now, Steve or Evan, do you have anything to add on, what kind of tools might be put in place, or, anything else to ensure not only do we mitigate, what's there, but we get them compliant and keep them there going forward?
I think our action tracking system would be, because when we have a maintenance record comes in, and before it's put into the action tracking system, the set of eyes that looks at it and sees, does it make sense? Did it meet all the requirements for the maintenance requirement that it was supposed to? And with that, then you can ask the question, well, maybe did they actually do this piece of the maintenance that is required? Or this looks, there's something that doesn't look good about this. There's something that just looks fishy about it. And then just ask those questions. Sometimes that conversation, you'll see that it's just a missed record or a missed signature, but we have a second set of eyes before it gets in, so we can track and maintain the maintenance requirements. It's also when we bring a new client on board. When we onboard a new client, we go through and with a clean set of eyes and clean set of head, build equipment list, PRC-5 equipment list, make sure all the records are there, and go back in history to make sure that all the historical records are there. So this client has a good PRC-5 equipment list and maintenance record document at that time, and then we start maintaining it. And I think that that's the important part, is to get the list complete, get it a good list, and then maintain it. And that Certrec is here to help maintain that, so that when the audit comes, it's not the gnashing of teeth that we sometimes see in the late nights that Dave was talking about earlier. Is to help the client be successful. That's what we're here for.
The equipment list that Steve mentioned, we spent probably the last 6 or 8 years developing that format, and we've developed it through our experience with PRC-5, but also feedback we've received from the regions. And without exception, every region we've worked in, and we've worked in virtually every region in the country. When they look at this format, they look at the detail and they look at the layout, they've all told us that it gives them the information that they need in a format that's easy to digest, and it makes their audit process easier. That's particularly important with PRC-5 because it is such a huge compliance standard. The amount of documentation can be voluminous. So anything we can do to make that audit process easier for the auditor helps sort of smooth out the process. If the auditor gets frustrated when they're trying to find the information they need to verify compliance, and they're struggling and they're dealing with information that's not well formatted, it makes their process harder, and it makes it easier for them to say, well, I just can't find it, so I don't see compliance here. Mm-hmm. So, when we get new clients and they have their information and we put it in this format, it goes a long way to getting them ready for an audit. And we've basically done everything we can do by putting that information in that format and giving it to the client to help maintain and update as the new maintenance activities are performed, so that when you hand that information over to the auditor has everything laid out in front of them, and it's very easy for them to verify that you've done what PRC-5 requires you to do.
Yeah, don't make them dig around to find it, right? Make it easy for the auditor, very, very clean and clear and smooth sailing, right?
have a very organized action tracking system, like Certrec has, the Certrec action tracking system itself, CAT, and then also making sure you have a good document repository, either in your action tracking or some other place that definitely ties it to. You want to have something that will tie your action, especially repetitive actions like in PRC-5, to your evidence in the end. You want to have those two married together so that you can cover that information quickly when you do have an audit.
So as we've said many times, and I think we've covered today, PRC-5 is large. It requires a good bit of work, but also a lot of understanding just of the standard itself in order to be compliant. So are there any closing remarks, any other information you think, people out there, registered entities would benefit from knowing with PRC-5?
One thing I'd like to add, Michelle, and you touched on it right then, that one of the key components is understanding. And what CATS does and what our process does is it allows us to meet periodically with our clients and talk to them about not only PRC-5, but all of their compliance activities that are coming up in the months ahead. And a lot of these activities, a lot of these maintenance activities have intervals that range anywhere from 4 months to 12 years. So a lot of times the people that we work with at the plant may not remember, how something was done, or, what the specifics are about a particular maintenance task. And these biweekly meetings that we have with our clients gives them the opportunity to say, you know what, I want to make sure, we've got this coming up in a couple of months, and we've got a new maintenance manager, we've got a new maintenance guy at the plant. I'd like you to talk to him just a few minutes and go over, what the requirement is in the standard. And so they'll bring that person into the call, or maybe it's just for their own edification. They'll say, now, remind me again how this works. And we can go through in very short amount of time and say, okay, this is what you have to do to make sure that you're in compliance with this maintenance task. And if their maintenance guys there, or their plant engineer, or whoever they want to have hear that, he can ask us questions. He can say, well, is it okay if I do that? And we can say, well, yes or no, or you know what, that's new. Let me look into that. And we can help them head off problems before they occur.
Certrec, we have a relationship with our clients to help them be successful. And that is the goal. And sometimes it comes into difficult conversations with them, but ultimately it is to help them be successful and to meet not just PRC-5, but all the standards that NERC has for them.
The bottom line is to have a successful program in place to ensure that all your documents are tracked and maintained properly, and that you have the evidence to show that in the end.
All right, guys, thank you so much for sharing today all of this wonderful information about PRC-5. Really appreciate you taking the time to enlighten all of us on how important and complex it is. And as always, we look forward to next time. Thank you for watching Conversations with Certrec. Someone from our team will be reaching out to you shortly to address questions that were asked during this stream. For additional questions about this stream, or for more information regarding how we can help empower you with Certrec's products and services, feel free to email us at support@certrec.com or give us a call at 817-738-7661, and we'll get you connected with one of our experts.